Dawn was gracious enough to share with me that a number of you chose to start attending this class because you are frustrated with the information that you are getting. And to the extent that that is the case, I want to congratulate you. The situation has been getting progressively worse, really since the September 11th of 2001. In one very real sense, it started when Bill Clinton, either under the influence of Jeffrey Epstein or simply the intention of betraying the Democratic Party, agreed to the consolidation of the news media. I congratulate you because the situation has been getting progressively worse since the closing years of the 20th century. Unfortunately, it goes back a great deal further, and that's why I wanted to have my napkin, because the lecture I attended was very well suited for Americans who have grown up in the United States and absorbed like children the attitudes of good Americans. That is, America is the exceptional nation. We may make mistakes, but we always intend well. We observe the democratic processes, and the unjust are punished and the just are rewarded. We have a meritocracy, so that if you merit a medal, you will get the medal, and if you merit judgment, you will receive judgment. All of these are the standard American story. It is, in fact, a sacred story. And I want to say this carefully. Most of us have one or more sacred stories. One of the individuals who, for a brief span of time, attended this class had the sacred story that I have just described. And I said some things about United States policy. I suspect it was foreign policy, but it may have been domestic policy. He took considerable offense to that. He didn't question my facts. He simply took offense at the fact that I was challenging his sacred story. And so he left us. And that was most unfortunate. But another lady who is very intelligent and was briefly connected with this class and was very enthusiastic and committed to opposing what is one of the current American themes, and that is providing surgical and hormonal assistance to young people who have some sense of sexual ambiguity. This woman, in my opinion rightly, was opposed to that because you would not allow a pre-teenager or a teenager to make certain life decisions that are literally irreversible, especially the surgical ones. So she was vigorously opposed to that particular element of the social management to which Americans are being subjected. I was glad to have her in the class. She had a different sacred story, and her sacred story affects economic justice and political justice. And I chose to critique that element and to attack her sacred story, not because I was opposed to the story, but because I felt it was imperative to oppose the story in as much as it was impinging on American foreign policy. It was impinging on a whole lot of things in the United States political and social scene. That sacred story happened to be the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust. And since the story was sacred for her, and I was challenging it, She felt that her world, these are my interpretations and words, she felt that her worldview was being challenged, and rather than submit herself to dealing with that challenge, she would leave the class. I was genuinely saddened by that. A cynic would call these stories sacred cows. But I respect the sacred stories as long as they don't interfere with justice, economic equitability, and a host of ideas that Americans in theory endorse. I say in theory because there's are great exceptions to it. So if you have any sacred story, take a very close look at them, because if they live in isolation, we probably won't touch on it. But if they impinge, for example, the story of Christian Zionism, I'm picking that one because it's relatively non-controversial at the moment. The story of Christian Zionism has been adopted by a substantial percentage of American Christians and provides substantial political support for the Zionist influence on the American government. Somewhere along the line, I'm going to tear it to shreds, or I'm going to appear to tear it to shreds. If someone wants to defend it, I'm delighted. In this class, if anyone wants to volunteer for the presenting of an alternative point of view, we'll designate a day, we'll announce it, and I want you to present the very best evidence you can for defending that point of view and acknowledge the alternative points. It is absolutely imperative to answer the alternative points. I'm prepared to do that with any of the subjects that I present, and I encourage you guys to do it. That's the only way to arrive at truth. Martin Luther was very accurate. He said, reason is a whore. As a theologian of the 16th century, he knew that theologians were perfectly capable of winding through a maze and winding up at the point they wanted to wind up at. Only if a person is committed to the truth and following it wherever he or she is led is going to find it, because otherwise your presuppositions, your emotional commitment is going to direct where your reason leads you. I may wish it were otherwise, but it isn't. So Martin Luther was right. So unless you have a love for reality, regardless of how it impinges on you personally, if you have a sacred story that impinges on economics or politics or etc., you might find some things that we talk about uncomfortable. One of them is not Jewish influence, but the influence of a particular subsegment of Jews on American policy, on American public opinion. Some people have avoided this subject by saying they are not opposed to Jews, but they are opposed to Zionists. I wish it were that simple, but it isn't. I'll give you a little vignette. In 1916, I'm still going to get to the cheat sheet. In 1916, the bankers of the United States, the industrialists of the United States, the Gentile bankers of the United States, as well as the Jewish bankers of the United States, I'll have to go back on that. The bankers of the United States, the industrialists of the United States, and Gentile newspaper editors of the United States wanted to get the United States into World War I. The Jewish editors of major newspapers, small vignette, in the middle of the second decade of the 20th century, the precursor people of the Council on Foreign Relations got together and discussed how many newspapers would it require to control American public opinion. They came up with a finite number, and inside of a decade, the precursors to the Council on Foreign Relations had control of these. In some cases, they had control of them before they ever got together. In other cases, they acquired them. In other words, there was a concerted effort to acquire the media power that the precursors to the Council on Foreign Relations felt that they required. We may or may not observe an interview that Norman Dodd gave to G. Edward Griffin. But in this interview, Norman Dodd describes his experience when he was the research director for the congressional committee that was investigating charitable organizations in the United States. The basic question of this congressional committee was, what are these organizations doing and what are they intending to do to American culture? You would think that was a very benign question. Norman Dodd found out that it was not at all benign. Okay. Some of our veteran students have had the benefit of growing up in a family of critical thinkers where all questions were allowed. The writer of Nickel and Dime, Barbara Ehrenreich, was raised in a similar family. Barbara Ehrenreich recently wrote a book called Living with a Wild God. She was raised in a family that was basically agnostic and, at least according to the title of her book, came to some kind of theological position other than agnosticism. Other people have retained that tradition of agnosticism. Not so much as a sacred story, but simply they haven't encountered any reason to change it. The person who left because they were uncomfortable with my questioning of her sacred story could not deal with that. Muslims have sacred stories. They believe that the revelation to Muhammad was given by an angel of God and are in fact the literal words of God. Where that is involved in the execution of law, it of course is very much an issue in civil society if Muslims live as a majority in a particular society or if they live as a minority in a particular society. One of the curious realities of that issue, however, is that according to Jewish theology, Jews are to live according to a Jewish version of Sharia law. It's not, strictly speaking, Sharia law. It's not the same Sharia law as the Muslims, but it is very definitely a theologically dictated law. It is observed by and large in Israel. If a secular couple, especially let us say a Muslim woman and a Jewish man, want to get married, they have to fly to Cyprus in order to do it. They can't be married in Israel as a multicultural or as a multi-religious couple. Can't be done. Illegal. The vast majority of public services terminate on Friday at sundown and are reactivated at Saturday on sundown. If that's not a form of Sharia law, I don't know what is. One of our veteran members tends to look for information in exceptional places. And I'm using the word exceptional because a less kind description would be the cesspools of information. And it is absolutely true that in some of the cesspools of information, there is legitimate information. The problem is distinguishing the 19 elements of misinformation and discovering the one element of actual and legitimate information. A bit about myself. In 1994, no, we'll go back a little further. I have the benefit of a very good education in the sciences. I'm a reasonably good understanding of physics, a very good understanding of chemistry, and a fairly reasonably good understanding of mathematics. I have my PhD in religion, and as such, I did for my dissertation a study of 4 religious books. I had 3 of them in front of me, and I had to create the last one. It turns out, those of you who know the Christian tradition, that there are 4 somewhat different versions of the life and death of Jesus, who is called by Christians the Christ. Matthew and Mark are the names of 2 of these evangelists, and Luke is a 3rd. John wrote the 4th, a writer who is named John wrote the 4th gospel. Gospels are the histories of the life and death of Jesus. It turns out that Matthew and Luke used the book of Mark as one of their sources. In the 20th and 21st century, that would be called plagiarism. In the 2nd century or 1st century, it was not plagiarism, it was simply augmenting the story that was common to all Christians. So it is possible to find out, it is in fact essential to find out, in my opinion, that to understand Matthew and Luke, it's necessary to find out how these 2 authors changed the versions of the story that appear in Mark. Because they were using Mark, and sometimes they copied Mark verbatim, and sometimes they modified this word, modified that word, changed this phrase. This is something of a problem for Christians of a certain ilk, but it's not a problem for a great many Christians. What is interesting, however, is that in addition to Mark, Matthew and Luke used a source which scholars call Q. The Q stands for Quelle, German word for source. My job as a graduate student was to isolate Quelle and describe the church and the community from which that document arose. In order to do that, I had to see what Matthew did with Mark, find the passages that Matthew and Luke have in common that aren't in Mark, and ascribe those passages to Quelle. Then, knowing Matthew's theology and Luke's theology, make a decent hypothesis as to what Q said before Matthew changed it and before Luke changed it. As such, it gave me a very good experience in understanding how 2nd and 3rd authors change a story. So I learned to read very critically. Not critical in the sense of denigration, but critical in the sense of understanding what distinguishes Matthew from Q, what distinguishes Luke from Q. That has served me well in the years subsequent, because I can read particular authors, whether it's Robert Fisk, or Ron Kuntz, or Eric Zeiss, and come to conclusions not only as to what the facts are, but where Zeiss's or Fisk's points of view may or may not impinge. I pick those authors because I find them to be, by and large, very reliable. What do I mean by reliable? I do not mean they are always right. What I mean by reliable is they will tell you the truth as they best understand it. It's your job and my job to extricate the truth from Zeiss's point of view, from Bob Fisk's point of view, from Jonathan Cook's point of view, from Alex Jones' point of view. I particularly pick these sources, and I don't talk about what is the commentator for Fox News. Jim Glenn?
Tucker Carlson is one.
Pardon?
Tucker Carlson is one.
Yes, Tucker Carlson currently is being allowed to speak the truth on any number of occasions, somewhat to my surprise. I attribute that to the fact that the system is so comfortable in their misleading of the American public that they're allowing Tucker Carlson to speak the truth. On the other hand, Alex Jones is now turned off. The former wrestler,
Jesse Ventura
has been turned off. Twitter has been turned off on a number of sources. Facebook is being edited. All of the regular sources of information are being controlled. I'm sad to observe. So I read very particular people, and I will share my list of reasonably reliable sources with you by email, and I will share with you Eric Zeiss's list of reliable sources with you by email, recognizing that you are responsible for distinguishing their opinions from their information. The authors that I recommend have never lied to me. They've occasionally been wrong. They've occasionally been quite bigoted, or at least biased, but they have given me information that is accurate to the best of their ability. I can't ask for more. With my training and with your critical acumen, you can separate the truth out for yourself. In 1994, I suffered a personal catastrophe, which I do not go into. But it was one of those situations where one's worldview is totally destroyed, and so you set about reconstructing a worldview that corresponds, as best you know, to reality. When the attacks of September 11th, 2001 took place, I was in the operating room. So I did not have the psychological trauma of watching the planes hitting the buildings time and time again. That was a very well planned psychological attack on your minds. The way the 9/11 attacks were presented to the American public was a masterful way of generating public fear, public receptivity to authoritarian information, and the embedding of not only the information, but how you should think about it. And it was drummed into you both with fear and repetition that America has been attacked, that within 8 hours we knew who had done it, and America, quote, was at war. Now that is one of a multitude of different ways of interpreting the attacks of 9/11, but that was precisely the storyline that the powers that created the storyline wanted Americans to believe. And by and large they did. There were a few people who looked at those scenes and said, no way in hell. I was not one of them. I was in the OR, so I wasn't subjected to the psychological trauma that the vast majority of Americans were. But I did know a great deal about the Middle East. And the most sensible part of the story of 9/11, the part that made the most rational sense, was that Arabs were damned angry with Americans. They have decades of reason to be angry with Americans. And so the young lady who came in and said, 2 planes just flew into the World Trade Centers. No, she said, accidentally flew into the World Trade Center. That wasn't an accident. It was perfectly intentional, and my immediate interpretation was somebody is getting even with the United States government for the actions of the United States government in the Middle East. And that's the most rational element of the 9/11 story. A few years after that, in the process of reconstructing my worldview, because I was still in the process of finding out who I was and a whole lot of things about my personal life. I found out, I don't know if you call it one or two interesting facts, but I'll put them together because as a scientist, they are very important. In the history of modern steel and concrete construction, since the buildings were reinforced with steel and were faced with concrete structures. In the history of modern building construction of steel and concrete, 3 buildings have fallen due to fire. In itself, an interesting fact. But the second interesting fact is that all 3 buildings fell on the same day. Now that's nonsense. As a scientist, I know that's a cluster. If we were to graph the serum lithium concentration of everyone in this room, it would form a very slow rising, slow falling graph with the mean being quite low. Unless 1 or 2 of you were under therapy for manic depression, in which case that slow curve that they have over here, a high peak of substantially higher cerium lithium concentration, because the standard therapy up until a few years ago for manic depression was lithium supplementation. That lithium group is a cluster, and you explain that high lithium concentration by other means than the broad low curve. Those 3 buildings that fell were a cluster. They fell either for additional reasons or different reasons than any other. Now, since they're the only 3 buildings that have fallen due to fire, the reason is not due to fire. That led me to ask question 1. The answer to question 1 led me to ask question 2. Getting question 2 answered led me to lesson 3. 4 years ago, I had the privilege of delivering a set of lectures at the, what is it called?
Senior college.
The senior college. Thank you, Russell. I suffer from anomic aphasia. Probably half the people here suffer from anomic aphasia. When you go for a name, especially if you want it now, it goes. Anyway, again, elder, senior college. Depending on how you look at it, it was a grand success or a miserable failure. 70 people were registered for it, and at the end of the 4th lecture, 40 people were still attending. Either I had an attrition rate that is horrible and was about 30%, or I had a retention rate of 70%. Kind of depends on how you look at it. It goes back to the lady in this class who could not deal with the challenge to her sacred story. And the vast majority of Americans have adopted, they have assimilated, they have absorbed a sacred story, the sacred story that the United States government is there to protect you. You know, the classic joke, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. On an individual basis, everyone knows that that is a joke, but it is still part of our underlying American mythology. Questions or comments so far? Tom?
My projector has gone to sleep. Hopefully get back out of here.
Well, I bet it'll come back to life.
It's set to go off after 5 minutes.
I want to show you a very short film that is a an allegory. It is an allegory of the situation in which the whole world finds itself. Okay, that's the reason. Okay. Okay. I want to tell anyone who's viewing this on the internet is you can find this program at imdb.com. It is a subsidiary to Amazon. It was available free on the internet for a couple years, and then somebody decided they could make an extra 50 cents by putting it under copyright protection. But imdb.com, the title of it is Playhouse Presents The Man. Dawn and I have both learned from prior experience. That's why I announced it, because this is going to have to be cut from whatever is presented on the Senior Center channel. One of the questions that I entertained in the back of my mind for much of the summer was that when did the West and the United States in particular start going so wrong as they are in the 21st century? I am going to guess that, who can tell me what the 13th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States says?
Which one?
Yes. Tom, you're supposed to keep your mouth shut. I know you know. Everyone who's been in this class before knows that. But Tom gave it away. The original 13th Amendment prohibited the acceptance of titles of honor from the British Crown. In the War of 1812, private ship captains were commissioned by the British Crown to act as pirates on American shipping. They were given titles of honor as a reward for acting as pirates. The United States amended its Constitution by asserting that anyone who accepted a title of honor from the British Crown would lose their American citizenship and be subjected to a whole host of other punishments. That amendment is mentioned in at least 16 history books that were published between 1818 and 1868. If you go to, you won't find it under Google because it has been censored. But if you go to DuckDuckGo, you can find out the exact wording of the original 13th Amendment and what it was intended to do. Between 1818 and 1867, that amendment, quite literally, was disappeared. I intentionally phrased it in a passive voice because it didn't just disappear. It was disappeared. Scholars stopped talking about it. Agents of government stopped talking about it. People in journalism stopped writing about it. It simply was, in fact, finding out when it was actually enacted is either difficult or impossible. That it existed, we know, but it has been expunged from the history of the United States as effectively as any obscene anti-patriot would be expunged from America. The only reason we learn about bad guys is so that you learn about the good guys. That amendment disappeared and was replaced with the amendment eliminating or forbidding slavery Now, think about the number of people who had to agree to disappear the original 13th Amendment. A lawyer, when he becomes a member of the British Admiralty Registry, BAR, when a lawyer becomes a member of the Bar Association, that he becomes an esquire. That is a title of honor in the British legal system. So if a lawyer was a member of the Bar Association, he would be prohibited from taking office in the United States. He or she would be at risk of losing their United States citizen. They would become an American unperson. So people in journalism had to agree to it. People in the practice of law, people in government had to agree that this amendment had to disappear. A number of other things happened. In 1868, it is a very complicated history, but everything that was enacted by Congress during the Civil War, so-called Civil War, is legally suspect. And it is only exercised by law because everyone in government agrees to exercise it by law. The Federal Reserve System was created by a system of private banks. And it is private banks that own the stock in the Federal Reserve System. As best I can tell, the Federal Reserve System became the official organ for, not of, but for the United States government because they had, this system of banks had made loans between 1868 and 1913 that were payable back to the public, to the private banks in 1913. They made loans of credit, but these loans were repayable in gold. I don't have enough information to give you page number on that. So some of this information is less than 100%. And I'll try to identify it when it is less than 100%. The point that I am making is that the Federal Reserve System became an instrument for the federal government either by coercing the government to accept those terms or by bribing a substantial number of congresspersons to pass the Federal Reserve Act. Everyone here probably pays income tax and is either contributing to or is receiving money back from Social Security. The Social Security Act is one way of getting you to volunteer to be a federal citizen. Up until 1868 or thereabouts, or actually, I should put it, since the apparent enactment of the second 13th Amendment, a new kind of citizenship was created, and that is federal citizenship, not American citizenship, federal citizenship. All liberated African slaves became federal citizens when that amendment was passed. When you accepted the Social Security number, you became a federal citizen. You volunteered to be a federal citizen because the federal citizenship means that you are a citizen of the District of Columbia doing business as the United States of America. Now there's a lot of information in what I just said. I can document it hand over fist. I'm simply asking you to be aware that you have been lured into a system of control that did not exist before the War of Northern Aggression. That's why I consider the first 13th Amendment as a crucial turning point when the United States government was subverted by individual interests. So that's kind of a teaser, because these are some of the questions that we will be addressing. And I say we because I'm a fellow student with everyone else here. But these are some of the issues that we'll be addressing. I would like to change gears now and ask for your participation. I'm going to give you a statement with 2 blanks in it. I want you to think about the statement, and I would like you to fill in the blanks. In any bureaucracy, 90% of the rules are created to deal with blank blank of the personnel. I'll repeat it. I wish I should have put it up there. In any bureaucracy, 90% of the rules, R-U-L-E-S, because my pronunciation is less than perfect. 90% of the rules are created to deal with blank blank of the personnel. Any suggestions for filling in the blanks?
Control.
That would be one way of finishing the sentence. You're absolutely correct there. But if anyone has worked in a bureaucracy, whether that bureaucracy is the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics, whether it is the Department of Education of the United States government, whether it is IBM, the question has to do with psychology rather than control. In any bureaucracy, 90% of the rules are created to deal with of the personnel. Any other suggestions? Tom?
Compliance.
That's the same as that, and it would finish the sentence. But the point that I am making is not to keep you on the edge of your seats. And I know this from working in X number of bureaucracies. In any bureaucracy, 90% of the rules for that bureaucracy are created to deal with 10% of the people. It is 10% of the people in any bureaucracy who stretch the rules in this direction so that they can get an extra 3 days of vacation. Who stretch the rules in this direction so that they can show up at 8:05 without being penalized. Who stretch the rules in this direction and stay out for lunch for 35 minutes instead of being back in 30. Does that ring a bell with anyone or everyone?
I thought it was 80-20.
Pardon me?
I thought there was the 80-20 rule. You know, that an 80-20 rule instead of 90-10.
I'll give you that. No,
I mean, that's
80-20, yeah.
Yeah, that
Because-
most of the people, yeah.
80-20, 90.
You spend
Having worked in
80% of
several.
your energy to work.
I think in terms of most bureaucracies, things start to change when you have more than 10% pushing the envelope. Up until the 10 or 15%, the bureaucracy maintains its character of doing its job and dealing with the people who are pushing the envelope. But what happens to that bureaucracy? Any bureaucracy, when it becomes 25% instead of 20, when it becomes 35% instead of 20. What happens to the bureaucracy?
It's unstable.
It becomes unstable, it acquires a different character. It acquires the character where it is working so hard to preserve itself that it starts failing at doing its original job. If its original job is to provide unemployment checks, it is also working hard at preserving its power.
Well, that's the way it is with institutions, though. I mean,
That's what I'm calling a bureaucracy,
I
yeah.
mean, like Penn State and Sandusky and
Absolutely.
the Catholic Church and the priests.
You're talking about a bureaucracy. Yes.
Everything has that, unions, I mean, everything
What you,
ends up
yeah.
evolving.
it ends up evolving, and when the signers of the Declaration and the original Constitution, they were relying on a certain culture. They were relying on the culture. The writers of the Constitution themselves said, no book of laws is going to maintain a stable civil society by the implementation of laws. They knew that. The culture and civilization, the stability of the society was dependent on the culture, not on the laws. One of the classic differences today between Russia and the United States, or let's say, shall I use the United States? No, let's use Sweden. One of the basic differences between Sweden today and Russia is that if a woman is raped in Sweden by an immigrant from Libya, to report that is a racist crime. Sounds absurd, but it is.
To report the act, or
report-
to report that it's someone from a foreign country.
To report that they were raped by a person from a foreign country, that is a racist crime, okay? In Charlottesville, Virginia, a group that I would oppose applied for a license to march in Charlottesville, Virginia. A group that was opposed to this group did not apply for a license to march, did not apply for any approval. However, when the latter group attacked the former group, it was the former group that was judged in the press and in the courts as being at fault.
The latter group was, I mean, it was also in the press. I mean, and people were
Some of the
talking
press,
about-
yes.
It wasn't just one way, it was both. It's free press, though.
Oh, I would agree with you. In any situation, I'm attempting to characterize a breakdown of a social order.
Okay.
In this case, the rule didn't matter that you had to have a permit. It
In
was
the case,
the result.
exactly. In other words, I would like to deal with the decline of the United States. And I'm not going to answer all questions. I'm not going to convince anybody. I'm not interested in convincing. I'm interested in raising the questions. The issue is for this discussion. Pardon?
Say the last sentence again there, what prompted it?
The people who have observed Julian Assange in his recent court appearances, such as Craig Murray, have changed their opinion and have decided that what the British system is subjecting Julian Assange to amounts to torture, and that torture is of such a severity that they fear for his survival to the end of the process. And that's
I
Craig
just wanted to
Murray.
hear you say it again because I don't have either.
I understand. But I am saying it sometimes in an inflammatory fashion because I want to call attention to the fact that the session that I was at before coming here, everyone had the same worldview. And that worldview needs desperately to be challenged if Western civilization is going to survive. Right now, and my fellow participants have heard this before, right now, American society is in the process of collapsing. Right now, something like 50% of the American population have been effectively thrown away by the man. If we don't call attention to it, it's going to proceed. I would like to point out 3 lies that the man told to the banker. The man said, none of us are cold. The key element of the people who seek power is they seek power for power's sake. Everyone in this room is expendable from their point of view. Everyone in this room is expendable. So when they send young men and women to Iraq or Afghanistan, or when they contemplate sending them to Syria or Venezuela, they are cannon fodder. They are there to accomplish a job. Their lives are insignificant. Look at what the federal government has done to the Federal Veterans Administration system. And if you don't conclude that veterans are expendable after they've served their time, you're not looking at the same data that I look at. Well, we got to the 90% of the rules. There are some interesting people, and I think I will serve you well by telling you that we're going to be talking about some very interesting people like Larry Silverstein and Bill Gates and Julian Assange next week. The expectation, but I hope it's not. I hope your sacred stories and mine are consistent with what we're going to be talking about. Because does anyone here think that the American society is going to survive what it has been happening the last 20 years? I don't. But,
That's a good question.
pardon? Yeah. Thank you for attending.